Dr. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, the most iconic speech of the civil rights movement from one of the most well-known actors of that time. There's an interesting thing that's coming on with this. He's doing this speech. This is at the height of everything that was going on. And his mindset was he could potentially die. And we all know what happened to him later on. So I'm very curious about what sort of elements made this speech so powerful, impactful, and influential.
I have the pleasure to present to you Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr.
I love how he's helping out the young brother, making sure he's hydrated for the situation.
I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation.
Okay, very interesting way he starts this off. I'm happy to join with you today. That's classical rapport type of connection-based front ending of a speech. A lot of people use this technique, but he used it in a way where it's like, I'm happy to join with you today. Like, we're together. We're all in this together. It's this sort of us camaraderie thing. So he's setting up initially an us frame. This is our thing that we're all doing and that we all can be happy about. Another very, very interesting thing was his pacing and his tonality. He's taking his time, every word, and it's all very impactful. I am happy to join with you today, but not even that. It was a lot more powerful than that too. I am happy to join with you today. These pauses and him emphasizing certain words puts your attention on those and brings the person and wraps them into what he's actually saying. You get sort of locked in a spellbinding kind of way. So he's kicking it off. Rapport and spellbinding tonality. And on top of that, he's utilizing the reaction of the crowd to hype up their energy as well at the start of this. There's a social proof element of it, but it's also very powerful because it also draws everybody into what he's saying as everybody else around them gets drawn in. You get swept up into it as well. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, he's very accustomed to that whole thing. If you've ever been to a black church or churches in general, I don't necessarily know how the other denominations typically do that, but from my experience, you have this sort of fever pitch that goes on during the actual sermon, where everybody kind of gets swept up into an energy, gets consolidated, and sort of moves everyone. So he is leveraging that right now. He's leveraging and moving people's energy, and he's pacing them at the moment. A very powerful technique there. Very awesome. Go in first and foremost by creating a sense of camaraderie and a sense of warmth into your conversation. Don't rush your words and be comfortable holding the attention. Most things you want out of life involve other people. Want more money? Where's the money come from? Other people. You want better relationships? Obviously other people. Your own internal happiness and joy. You can't be surrounded by a bunch of chaos coming from other people. You have to be able to see through people's masks and be able to be creative and think laterally, solve all the problems, and be persuasive. Because if you don't, you're going to find yourself paranoid about people around you, unable to solve the problems that are facing you, feel overwhelmed, and ultimately not get the things that you want out of life. So in order to fix that, you need to become a brilliant problem solver who can see into people's souls and persuade them many different ways. That's going to allow you to take control of your environment, break through any plateaus, and reach your full potential. Click the link in the description below and get my free meditation that's going to open up your lateral thinking and problem solving abilities, and then schedule a call with my team so we can talk about how we can take you to your highest level.
50 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice.
I love it. So the first thing he did was he talked about Abraham Lincoln, obviously, and what he did with the Emancipation Proclamation. And he's referencing a great American. So what he's doing here is he's also, on top of just going to that place and bringing up the hope and the feeling and the vibe of all that, he's also creating a camaraderie amongst Americans. Like a great American did this, we're also Americans. There's a subtle sort of finessing of the idea that we're all one and we're all on the same kind of page sort of thing that he's embedding into that while he's saying that. And he's also creating a contrast here. He's bringing a person into a narrative story right now. He's bringing the audience into a narrative story. He's using elements that people understand already. See, he didn't have to say Abraham Lincoln and Emancipation Proclamation. I understood what he was talking about. So that is a technique where you speak around something in a way that a person inherently understands what you're talking about, allowing them to connect the dots. And when they do that, they are able to see your point of view a lot more clearly instead of you just saying the way that it is. If a person connects the dots on what you're saying, the message lands much better. Very artful, very skillful.
It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later,
all right, so he created a value after he went in and got people to resonate with a certain time that he wanted to, and then did an all-American connectivity as opposed to us versus them kind of thing. He took that and then he created pain around the situation, the suffering and et cetera, that was going on. And then this great American went and resolved that. He created a frame where that's what America wants and that's what America strives for. And then after that, he caveated it by using a transitional statement to bring it into what we are doing right now, currently in this time period, which is not basically living up to the standard of that. So what that does is there's actually several different things. For one, there's a consistency bias sort of thing. Like, why haven't we been consistent with the ideals we had before? But then there's also too an appeal to nobler motives where there's a standard that we should be setting and we're not living up to that. So he's utilizing efforts and authority of the past as well as the ideals of a moral standard to set a base for the argument that he's now about to present. So after warming them up and creating a unity kind of framework between every American and the crowd that's there currently, he then took an authority from a past authoritative figure in American history and set that as the ideal that America should strive for. Then he led that into a moral standard that the company strives for but currently isn't living up to. And then that is going to segue into his next point. So what that basically does is it gets you to buy into what he's saying, and it gets you to examine where you're at currently on that spectrum of what he's talking about and how do you measure up to great American people like Abraham Lincoln. And it makes you want to strive for better. That's the energy that he created right before he moved into his next thing.
the Negro still is not free.
All right, so after he did all of that, he then set up the problem. Like, even though all of this is going on, this is the problem. And he centered your mind onto that idea. So after creating all this emotional resonance and using this spellbinding tonality and pacing and crowd fever and all this sort of stuff, he brought your mind to this specific point, this problem pain point of why everyone's gathered here today. So he established a striving against this pain point before he introduced it, which creates this internal feeling, this intrinsic motivation to push against the problem. See, when I'm talking to clients, for instance, that's one of the things that I like to address a lot too. I like to try to find and pinpoint a specific problem. And before we actually get to that, I always love to create a wave of force against that. So when we hit that critical point of that problem, it makes it easy for them to blast through it instead of feeling like they're overwhelmed by the thing. Like, you create enough power and emotional resonance and force before you get to that point, then the momentum of that will blast you right through it. And then that's how you trigger action in an individual, whether it's purchasing a product, signing up for this thing, just agreeing to what you're talking about, creating a movement. Like, it does all of these sort of things. They're all the same thing.
100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination.
Okay, very interesting. It's funny how he intrinsically knows how to do this. Like, this is way before any kind of like marketing techniques or skills or sales triggers or any of that kind of stuff was like fleshed out in so much detail as it is these days. And what he's doing basically is the pain that he's creating is he's creating a sense of urgency. So after he created that momentum of energy towards this problem point and he clashed into it, he then amplified that momentum with pain. What pain does, and I say this in all of my videos, pain creates a sense of urgency. It creates a feeling of movement. Like you want to actually take some action to do something about whatever this current situation is. Pain has a spectrum. It can go from just slight frustration to depression to rage, a whole bunch of other sort of stuff. Pain has many colors. But what he's doing here essentially is he's accelerating the momentum that he just created at that moment. So he brought all this energy to bear to this one focal point, and then right after he did that, he started accelerating a person's want to change that through describing the pain. Now, the way that he's kind of going about it here is he's going over the sufferings of others. So he's leveraging a feeling of empathy out of the people. Like, you should feel empathetic towards these people's plight. Like, this is the type of pain that he's leveraging. Depending on what sort of spectrum they are, they're either hearing it and wanting to do something about it, or hearing it and not wanting to do anything at all. That's totally dependent upon their perspective. Because the weakness of this type of argument, this emotional appeal, is if the person that's hearing it has no emotional connection or empathy for the subject matter that you're trying to make them feel for, it's not going to work. They're not going to care. It's kind of like somebody describing to me the suffering of the roaches that are in a house or something like that. Like, I don't have roaches in my house. Let's say, for instance, I had roaches in my house and somebody tried to describe to me the suffering of those roaches, how hard it is on them, and I should have empathy for. I don't care. Like, that's not gonna make no difference. I'm trying to obliterate them. You know, like, that means nothing to me because of the negatives that I associate towards that thing, that unit, that concept, whether it's a person, a species, a thing, some whatever the case may be. Concept is what it is. The idea, essentially. The idea of black people being free and even and all those other sort of stuff in this time period. It's scary to a lot of individuals. They don't really know what is kind of going on. They segregated themselves. They want to protect themselves, etc., etc. A lot of all this stuff back then was due to a lot of fears. So I'm curious if he's going to address a fear resistance point in this. If he's trying to actually persuade those individuals who are blocked off to that type of argument, or is he just going to hone in on that argument and do it more and more and more and kind of just not even bother with those other types of people?
100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. This nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
Okay, so now he's appealing to the ideals of America. That's the frame here, and that's what he's been doing. The standard that America should be holding itself to, and he's trying to hold them accountable to that. Say, like, this is what we stand for. This is what our patriotism is about. This is what our country is about. So why shouldn't that be for everybody? Essentially, that's what he's saying. He's appealing to nobler motives. It's a Dale Carnegie principle. It's very powerful. I did a video the other day about the guy who attempted to assassinate the 45th president, Donald J. Trump. He used an appeal to moral standards argument also. So it's so powerful, this type of communication style. It is very extreme, and it's funny how we see it in a place like this at such a high level and a pivotal time in our history. But the only way for you to be able to appeal to nobler motives is to know which nobler motives are appealing to the audience. So he is talking to all of America. So he's utilizing the Constitution, the quotes, the historical figures and all that to get the broad support for what he's saying. If you were to try to do this with the individual, you will want to understand what that person actually cares about. So for me, if somebody was trying to get me to not obliterate all the roaches in my house, find some sort of other humane way to deal with the situation, they would talk to me about like the white rhinoceroses and these other borderline or extinct animals, and then trigger all the anger and resentment that I have towards people eliminating species off of our planet, harmful and aren't pests. And they would go to those nobler motives inside of me, and then that would be a gateway to open up me to being persuaded about something like that. It's something that when you really hone in on something like this for somebody, it's something they can't unfeel. It's something that's really embedded into their soul. And that's why it's so powerful and so impactful.
have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream.
I have a dream. Okay, I love the way that he set it up. So what he's doing here is he's now going into the goals, like the actual thing that he wants. It's almost like a call to action, essentially, but he's going into the idea that he's now trying to sell to people. So he set up this idea first with creating this standard and then talking about the issues, creating momentum and paying against that issue, and then holding a person to a certain moral standard. And then right after he had all of that lined up, then he went into the actual solution, the thing that he actually wanted. He accelerated it with pain right into the solution, and the way he's crafting it, he paused and said, I have a dream, boom, and then he went into his visualization. That's very skillful. That's very dope. I love that. He had to transition off of the pain into his actual solution and goal. And instead of saying we should do this, that, and this and that, what he did was he took it to a visualization, this ability to virtually see what he's saying. By saying I have a dream, he opened up the audience and everybody else to their imagination and their hope in that moment. So now when you're in a place like that, your conscious mind sort of lowers down and you get more into an observer kind of mode. And by doing that, you're now just feeling and observing and being carried and taken along narrative, as opposed to sitting there trying to critically assess everything that's being said. You get wrapped up and moved along the path of whatever that is. So powerful. Now, salespeople, marketers, and all this sort of stuff, this is like equivalent of like quote unquote painting the picture. Now he's painting the picture in a very artful way, and he's pacing a person through his painting of that picture. I have a dream. Boom. Here's the dream. Here, can you see the dream? Can you see this, that, or the third? And what's happening during that moment? You're literally feeling and visualizing and being drawn into what he's saying. You're being ultimately persuaded into it. So he's lowering down your resistance barriers and pulling you in directly into his idea that he wants you to actually have. And you weren't 100% on board before, you'll start to almost become brainwashed into it in that moment. It's very hypnotic.
That one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
That's also something he does very well too. Bars, for lack of a better term. My children being judged on not the color of their skin, but the content of their character. Like, this is an iconic statement that has been reverberating throughout history. Like, just like the constitutional lines he was quoting earlier, he's layering in quotables in the moment of him keeping you in the spellbinded visualization that he's doing. He takes you to the pain, and he goes to the solution, and then he lands it with a bar, a quotable line that brands the idea, essentially. And then it becomes this sort of like idea virality. That's like the old school virality right there. That's a meme. He created a meme, a quote that lands this whole concept that he created after going through that process.
I have a dream that one day down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification. One day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, and every hill and mountain shall be made low. The rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope.
All right, now he's going to the Bible, some of the quoting. So what he does is he takes ideas that people can resonate with and things that are familiar to people already, and he packages them in a way where it will create resonance. He's weaving in resonance while he's actually keeping a person in that spellbinded visualization of the ideas that he wants to implant into you at that moment.
This is a faith that I go back to the South with. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This will be the day. This will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with new meaning, "My country, tears of thee. Sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring, and if America is to be..."
There it is again. So you start to see the pattern of it while he's keeping a person in there, going through this visualization and then using colloquialisms or other things that people can immediately readily identify with and agree to. He's spiking up agreement with that and weaving it into his argument. So a person's like, yeah, I agree with that statement. Yes, that's saying I resonate with that. Yes, I'm hopeful for that. And he's winding up the crowd, wounding them up and energizing everybody with all of this at the same time. Passion, momentum, resonance, and pacing.
A great nation. This must become true. And so let freedom ring from the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire. Let freedom ring from the mighty mountains of New York. Let freedom ring from the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania. Let freedom ring from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado. Let freedom ring from the curvaceous slopes of California. Not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring.
And so he's pacing the energy up too. So as he's going, it's like he's going. It's like that. That is a very powerful technique, especially when you want to shift a person's energy. They call it mirroring in this day and age. Jordan Belfort talked about this in his book, The Way of the Wolf. Very interesting sales book. You should check it out if you haven't listened to it already. There's a pacing portion of it where you kind of find where the person is, kind of go in where they're at right there. And then as you're pacing them, you start to lead them as well. So you're pacing the leading as opposed to just their pace. So say a person is very angry. You're going to come in angry too. Then you're going to come in a little bit less angry, a little bit less angry, and a little bit less angry, and then a little bit happy, neutral, then a little bit less neutral, more happy, and then more happy, and then happy, and then happy, and then purely happy. That's how you sort of shift a person's emotional state from one place to the next. And so he's shifting their emotional state into the crescendo of his speech, the punchline of it, the thing that he actually wants. And he's utilizing the same techniques, bars. He's utilizing branded lines, branded techniques, and resonance and colloquialisms, and also setting a moral standard for people to strive to live up to, and justifying that moral standard from things that people can resonate with and agree to.
And when this happens, when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual. Free at last, free at last,
free at God Almighty. I'm free at last. Bars, that's what it is. So it's bars. It's like I see what he's doing and I see the effectiveness of this. So he's utilizing different techniques. Every kind of video that you'll see, it has some sort of combination of things like resonance, accelerating movement when it comes to like sense of urgency or whatever. People setting their arguments up in a way where somebody can actually like land with it, understand it basically, and then putting some sort of mechanism where that person can agree to that argument. So then his style is utilizing a whole bunch of different tonalities technicalities and pacing and leading and colloquialism, sayings, things that people resonate with, using moral standards that people can agree to, setting it up, and then creating empathy around the idea of the pain and the plight, and then leveraging that empathy into acceleration and movement, and then pacing that up, and then getting to a place where you can then calm the person's down, get them to visualize what you're saying, and then slowly build up their agreement into that visualization. Like after you set all this stuff up, and then they're in there and they're wrapped up into your words, then you start making them see the energy, see the idea, and then going from one to the next, landing branded bars on the person over and over and over again, and wrapping them up into the ideal that you want. And then that can take your words over the course of history.